Good morning and welcome to Pop TV. Today we will be interviewing teachers on the tragedy that happened on September 11th, 2001. Afterwards, there will be a showing of the 9/11 ceremony performed by ROTC. Experiences with like 9/11 and stuff like that.
Okay. This being the 20th anniversary of 9/11, I vividly remember that entire day. I was in this classroom that I've been in for 25 of my 26 years here. When I first heard about it, I turned the morning show on, and we used to have audio-visual carts that we would have in the classroom. We didn't have the projection screens. And I remember putting on, the class ended, first period, I had second period block schedule, and I put the TV on, and it was ESPN. I was going to check some baseball scores. And I remember ESPN had a picture of the first tower on fire. And I just was shocked, and they were talking about it being a small plane, and having lived in New York for a while, I knew that it couldn't have been a small plane. So I went next door to my department head's room, Bill Hartley, who had been here since the school opened, let him know, and I talked to a few other teachers in the department and let them know that this had happened. And by the time I realized, the second building had been hit. And for the rest of the day, it was just, worrying about my children. I couldn't get a hold of them. They were at different schools in the county. My wife was working up the road. And then I had some colleagues that were from New York and knew that they had friends that were in the building. And one of my former colleagues lost one of his friends on that day that was in one of the towers. So it's, for many people, it's a footnote in a textbook. A lot of the students, obviously, the majority of the students here were not even born 20 years ago. But if you look around the corner here, we have a depiction of Ground Zero. And a lot of the students that come to school here don't even realize that that's what that picture is that was drawn by our Lecanto School of Art students. But I don't think I'll ever forget that day. I think it's one of those things where my dad talked about Pearl Harbor and John F. Kennedy's assassination, but to me, 9/11 was a defining moment, and definitely in my life.
Thank you so much, Mr. Bell. What happened when you were alive during 9/11?
Sure. So I was in college, and I remember just waking up that morning. I actually went to school outside of Boston, and so I had stepped out of my dorm room, and a couple of guys had already been up and had kind of put on the TV, and they were like, "Hey, this plane flew into one of the towers." And so I just remember, as time went on, more and more people just started coming around the TV. We didn't really understand what it was. We just thought it was something small that had hit. And then eventually what happened, we had class, and I went off to class, and by the time I got to my first class, they had canceled classes for the day and sent us all back home. And so it was just this weird sense of, not knowing what had happened. Even more interesting, I guess, for me is that evening, my grandmother had passed away that a couple days before, and her wake was in the city in Boston. And you got to remember that the planes took off from Logan Airport in Boston. And so I remember driving into the city that evening and just it being a ghost town. Like everything was shut down. And so, just this sense of, could there be more coming? We just didn't know, honestly.
So what was your experience on the 9/11 attacks?
On the 9/11 attacks, I remember that day clearly. I was at home cleaning. My youngest daughter was a baby, and I saw the news, and I called Coach Roush. She was working, and I said, a plane just flew into the Twin Towers. And as I was watching it, another plane hit, and I still get goosebumps today. It was just shocking.
All right. So what was your experience with 9/11 when it happened?
I remember exactly what happened at 9/11. We were in marine biology class. One of my students was at the office. She came down and told us that a plane had just run into one of the World Trade Centers. We turned on the TV just probably about 5 minutes before the second plane hit. And from there, it's history.
History. So what was your experience on the attacks of 9/11?
I was in college, and I remember vividly, I got up that morning and I was heading to class, and I had a guy actually pass me in the hallway, and he said a plane just hit one of the Twin Towers. And I literally thought to myself, that's unfortunate. it didn't register like what that meant. And so I kept on walking to class, and I got to my class, and in that whole class it was empty. Like there was nobody there. And so like I went to my professor's office, and when I looked in there, like the entire class was shoved in his office, like looking at this small TV. And like as I walked in, the second plane hit the second building, and that's when it really like struck me, and like, I was dumbfounded at how something like this could happen, how terror could happen in our own homeland. And so so from that day, I mean, the rest of the day was just a blur of just watching the screen. And I left his office, went back to my room, and just watched the rest of the day as the towers fell, as the interviews happened, as people were crying. And I guess the thing that made it real for me, and what really changed for me, was how people who like got religious, and how they cared about each other, how they looked out for one another. People who used to be, against each other were picking each other up. And that's what the good thing that happened. If there's any good that could have happened, that's what happened that was good, was the country seemed to unite in that moment instead of being so segregated. And that was I guess the only good thing for me.
Battalion, attention! Flag detail, post! Detail, hold, post. Arm! Order, arm! Parade, rest! Post. Take it right. About face. Tomorrow marks the 20th anniversary of the terrorist attacks that occurred on September 11, 2001 in New York City, Washington, D.C., and on Flight 93, which crashed in rural Pennsylvania. As I look out in the stands at my classmates, It goes without saying that we do not remember that day, as we were not born yet, or we were too young to remember this tragic event. Even though we do not remember what happened on this day, surely we will never forget. On September 11th, there were nearly 3,000 innocent lives lost, from those that were working in the World Trade Center, to firemen and police officers attempting to rescue people trapped in the towers, to soldiers serving our country in the Pentagon, to the passengers of the hijacked airlines. Every 11th of September, we come together to remember their sacrifices, along with recognizing the victims' families, witnesses, and survivors who are having to live with what they saw that day. To prevent future acts of terror in America following the attacks of September 11th, the United States waged a war on terrorism in Afghanistan. This war lasted a total of 20 years and was concluded at the end of August this year. Throughout the war, the United States suffered over 2,000 casualties while trying to protect our freedoms. So why is it important for us to commemorate this day? This day serves as a reminder that we must not forget. We must not forget those who have been killed in the terrorist attacks, along with not forgetting the police officers, firemen, and random civilians who had assisted after the tragedy. We must not forget those who have fought in Afghanistan for the past 20 years as a result of these attacks and trying to prevent future ones. We must not forget the brave airline passengers who sacrificed their lives to save many more. Even though we weren't around to see these events that took place on September 11, 2001, we still must remember that the lives were lost that day and the soldiers that had died in the war on terror over the last 20 years. Taking a few moments out of the day to pause and honor them is the least we can do to show respect for those lives lost and patriotism for our nation and freedom. We must never forget. Thank you for coming to the ceremony. Battalion, attention! Sergeant Major. Company First Sergeant and Commander, take control of your company.
Flag detail. Move. Take it up, take it down.
Thank you all for attending. That concludes our ceremony. I appreciate your support and coming out to see us.
Flag detail. Leave the flag there. Tie it back up and leave it. Right, face.